The Republic is undoubtedly Plato's most important work. Composed of 10 books, it contains the main doctrines of Platonic philosophy. Here, the philosopher's thoughts are laid out, including his doctrine of ideas, according to which the world we perceive with our senses is not the ultimate reality but merely a shadow or reflection of a truer and more permanent world, the world of ideas or forms. Plato's theory and beliefs regarding the soul are also present, portraying it as an immortal and eternal entity that exists before inhabiting a body and survives the body's death. Throughout the Republic, Plato elaborates on his vision of an ideal state, devoting himself to the discussion and construction of an ideal city, addressing how justice, governance, education, and philosophy would be managed there. In his pursuit of protecting this ideal republic, Plato commits an act that would later define the relationship between philosophy and literature: the expulsion of poets from the Republic. Plato justifies this expulsion on moral and intellectual grounds. Poets do not tell the truth. Their stories are false and often depict heroes and gods acting immorally, potentially influencing citizens, especially the youth, in negative ways. Poetry is an imitation of the sensory world, which is itself an imitation of the world of ideas. Therefore, poetry is doubly removed from the truth. Plato argues that philosophy seeks truth through reason and intellect, while poetry appeals to emotions and can disturb the rational balance of the soul. With these points in mind, Plato sought to strip poetry of the prestige it held in his time, aiming to establish philosophy as the sole path to truth and the only source of knowledge. This stance would lay the foundation for the conflict and tension between philosophy and literature in subsequent history, wherein philosophy sought to maintain its status and supremacy over literature and other disciplines. However, over time, philosophy lost this privileged position with the rise of science. Newton's work, grounded in observation, controlled experimentation, and mathematical analysis, marked the ascent of modern science. This shift led to a greater reliance on scientific methods for obtaining reliable and objective knowledge about the natural world. By its very nature, science avoids the idealisms of philosophy, which tends to seek the ultimate reason behind things in demiurges, perpetual movers, substances, monads, or absolute spirits, metaphysical entities philosophers have long used to explain reality. On literature's side, poets throughout history have defended their art. In the 14th century, Boccaccio did so in the genealogy of the pagan gods, and later, poets like Shelley in a defense of poetry continued to argue in its favor at the beginning of the 19th century. It also becomes evident that philosophers often misunderstand the nature of literature. They fail to grasp the concept of fiction, treating it as though it were reality, while literature, on the other hand, does not take its own stories, gods, or actions seriously. Instead, it openly mocks both philosophy and religion, ridiculing their doctrines and conceptions. A categorical example of this is the work of Lucian of Samosata, which is clearly skeptical and critical of religions and philosophies. In his dialogues and stories, gods and philosophers are ridiculed. Take, for instance, A True History, a satirical and fantastical work written by Lucian in the 2nd century AD. It parodies the travel and exploration tales popular in ancient Greece and Rome. Lucian presents a true history as a travel narrative beginning with his departure from the island of Samosata on a maritime voyage. During their journey, Lucian and his crew encounter a series of strange lands and islands. One of these is the Isle of the Blessed, where the souls of various heroes and wise men reside after death. In describing the island and its inhabitants, Lucian writes,
"I also saw Socrates, son of Sophroniscus, conversing with Nestor and Palamedes. Around him were Hyacinthus of Sparta, Narcissus of Thespii, Hylas, and other handsome youths. It seemed to me he was enamored with Hyacinthus, for it was him he refuted most frequently."
A few paragraphs later, when describing the relationships among the island's inhabitants, Lucian mentions Socrates again.
"As for their practice of love, they openly engage with both women and men in public view, without finding it shameful. Only Socrates kept swearing oaths, claiming his relations with the youths were pure, though many accused him of perjury, as Hyacinthus and Narcissus themselves often confessed while he denied it."
These passages clearly reference Socrates' paiderastia, which was well known in antiquity. Earlier in the text, Lucian mocks the Republic when explaining why Plato is not present on the Isle of the Blessed.
Plato alone was not there, as they said he lived in the city he had imagined, enjoying the constitution and laws he had drafted himself.
Lucian also ridicules Plato in another passage, speaking of the customs of the island's inhabitants.
Women are held in common, and no one feels jealousy towards their neighbor. In this they are more Platonic than Plato himself.
In the banquet or the lapiths, a dialogue set during a wedding banquet, one character says,
"It would be best not to need marriage, but to follow Plato and Socrates in loving young men. At least, only those who act thus can achieve perfection in virtue. However, if one must marry women, then according to Plato's thesis, wives should be held in common, so that we may be free from jealousy."
But it is not only Plato and Socrates who are the targets of Lucian's humor and criticism. Across his works, various philosophical schools of his time are mocked: Pythagoreans, Platonists, Stoics, Cynics, and Epicureans. He accuses them all of hypocrisy, preaching virtue and abstention from luxury while practicing the opposite. In this sense, in the dialogue Menippus or the Necromancy, where Menippus descends to the underworld and returns to recount what he saw, he speaks of the philosophers.
But what struck me most about them was this: upon close observation, I discovered that these same individuals behaved in ways entirely opposite to the doctrines they preached. Those who exhorted others to despise wealth clung to it, quarreling over inheritances, tutoring children for fees, and enduring any humiliation for riches. Those who rejected fame tailored all their words and deeds solely to achieve it. And almost all who condemned pleasure indulged in it entirely.
In the Fisherman or the Resurrected ones, one character comments on philosophers in general.
Everything they say, such as that they despise wealth and fame, that they only consider beauty and self-restraint as good, and that they look down upon grand figures while speaking to them as equals, sounds very noble, divine even, and too wise and admirable to be true. All these things they teach for money, staring in awe at the rich and gaping at wealth, more irritable than puppies, more cowardly than hares, more flattering than monkeys, more stubborn than donkeys, more thieving than cats, and more quarrelsome than roosters. Naturally, they make themselves ridiculous when they scramble and jostle for wealth, elbowing each other at the doors of the wealthy, attending banquets with large crowds, flattering excessively, overeating beyond moderation, and inserting unpleasant, out-of-place philosophy into their cups of wine. The common folk there, of course, laugh and develop an absolute aversion to philosophy, as it produces such individuals.
Plato sought to diminish the prestige of poetry and delegitimize it, aiming to grant philosophers control over education in the city-states, a role for which they competed with poets. In fact, the rivalry between poets and philosophers predates Plato. Other prominent philosophers like Xenophanes, Pythagoras, Empedocles, and Heraclitus also argued against poets in favor of philosophers. On the poet's side, Aristophanes mocked philosophers in his comedy The Clouds, where Socrates is portrayed as an arrogant, poorly dressed, and conceited vagabond. Thus separated by the concept of fiction, literature has mocked the pretensions of both philosophy and religion. Lucian's works are not the only example. Other irreverent literary works include those by Miguel de Cervantes, François Rabelais, and Geoffrey Chaucer, among others. Finally, it is ironic how philosophers have used literary forms to disseminate their works. Plato himself, before Lucian of Samosata, employed dialogues and made use of myths, recognizing their functional value and making his reflections accessible. Over the centuries, this trend has continued. Philosophy often cloaks itself in literature to reach a broader audience that might otherwise ignore it. In this sense, the novels and plays of Albert Camus and Sartre are crafted. Literature can do without philosophy or stand against it, while the latter, however elevated, finds in literature a refuge without which it might dissolve into abstraction and oblivion.